Some people think age slows you down. They're wrong. Age just teaches you when to move and when to be still. I'm 68 years old. I raised my granddaughter, Ivy, by myself in a little house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where your neighbors know your business whether you want them to or not. Her mother, my daughter, passed when Ivy was 4. A car accident on I-70, a Tuesday morning in February, a patch of black ice nobody warned anybody about. After that, it was just the two of us. I worked 31 years as a paralegal at a mid-size firm downtown. I know how paperwork works. I know how people use paperwork to take what isn't theirs. And I know the difference between a man who loves a woman and a man who loves what a woman has. I started noticing the difference when Ivy brought him home. His name was Trent. Trent Albright. He was 32, worked in commercial real estate, drove a clean car, had good posture, called me ma'am the first time we met. He had the kind of manners that come from coaching, not from upbringing. I could feel it, like someone had drilled it into him somewhere along the way. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Ivy was 29, and she looked at that man the way I hadn't seen her look at anything since she was a little girl, watching the first snow of the season fall outside our kitchen window. So I watched. I watched him for 8 months before I said a single word. The thing people don't understand about watching is that it isn't passive. You're collecting. You're filing things away. The way he changed the subject when money came up. The way he'd glance at his phone and put it face down a half-second too slow. The way his mother, Harriet Albright, looked at Ivy, not at her face, but past it, like she was calculating something. Harriet Albright. Lord. She was 63, recently divorced from her second husband, lived in a large house in Dublin, Ohio, that was nicer than anything she could afford on her own. She drove a Lexus. She wore clothes that said money, but her eyes said debt. The first time I met her was at a dinner. Ivy organized at her apartment. She wanted everyone to get along. She wanted us to love each other. The way young people in love always want everything to be simple. It wasn't simple. I shook Harriet's hand, and she held mine about 2 seconds longer than necessary, studying my face like she was trying to remember where she'd seen me before. She hadn't, but I knew her type. I'd filed paperwork for her type for 3 decades. After dinner, while Ivy and Trent were in the kitchen cleaning up, Harriet leaned toward me on the couch and said, casually, like we were old friends, Ivy tells me she received quite an inheritance when her mother passed. It must be such a comfort for both of you. I looked at her. I smiled. I said, Ivy's done very well for herself. I did not say another word about it. That was the moment I understood exactly what I was dealing with. Here's what Harriet didn't know, and what I'd never told anyone outside of my own attorney. When Ivy's mother died, the life insurance policy paid out $340,000. I put it in a trust, a properly structured, irrevocable trust that I set up through the firm where I worked. One of the senior partners owed me more favors than I could count, and he made sure it was airtight. Ivy wouldn't receive access to the principal until she was 30. She was 29. She knew the trust existed. She did not know the full amount because I had raised her to understand that money talked too much and too loud in the wrong company. She had never told Trent the number. I had made sure of that. After that dinner, I started watching Harriet more carefully than I watched Trent. Because in my experience, it's rarely the person you're marrying who's the problem. It's the family they can't separate themselves from. Trent proposed to Ivy in October. She called me that night, crying the good kind of tears, and I told her I was happy for her. I was happy for her. That part was real. But I also sat in my kitchen after we hung up, and I thought about Harriet's face at that dinner, and I thought about the trust, and I thought about what the next 12 months were going to look like. I decided it was time to have a conversation with my granddaughter, not a lecture. Not a warning she'd dismiss as an old woman being suspicious. I'd seen what happened when grandmothers warn too abstractly. The young woman rolled her eyes, stayed in love, and then called crying 6 months after the wedding. I wasn't going to do it that way. I asked Ivy to come over on a Sunday afternoon in November, about 2 weeks after the engagement. I made her coffee the way she liked it. 2 much cream, 1 sugar, and I sat across from her at my kitchen table and I told her about my career. Specifically, I told her about 3 cases I'd worked over the years. Cases involving families who had tried to access trusts, inheritances, and insurance payouts that didn't belong to them. I changed the names, the way I always did when I talked about work. But I made the details specific enough that she understood what I was describing. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, "Grandma, are you talking about Harriet?" I said. "I'm talking about a pattern I recognize." She nodded slowly. She wasn't defensive. That was the thing about Ivy. She was smart, and she trusted me in a way that was earned, not assumed. I'd been there for every hard thing in her life. She knew I didn't speak unless I meant it. I told her 3 things that afternoon. 1, do not share the trust information with Trent's family. Not the amount, not the structure, not the name of the trustee. 2, if anyone presents her with a legal document after the wedding and asks her to sign it on the spot, she calls me immediately. She does not sign. Not ever. Not for any reason. 3, if Trent is the man I hope he is, none of this will matter. But if he isn't, she needs to be protected before she finds out. She promised me all 3. The wedding was in April. A Saturday warm for Ohio in spring. Ivy wore her mother's pearl earrings. I sat in the front row and I watched my granddaughter walk toward a man I still wasn't sure about, and I kept my face steady, because that was my job that day. The reception was at a venue outside the city. I sat at the family table and I made polite conversation and I watched Harriet work the room. She was good at it. She touched arms, she laughed at the right moments, she said the right things about Ivy's dress. But twice during the evening, I caught her looking at Ivy with that same calculating expression I'd first noticed at dinner. And once I saw her in a corner with Trent, speaking quietly, and when Trent came back to the table, his jaw was set in a way it hadn't been before. I filed it away. I went home that night, and I called my attorney first thing Monday morning. The call I made was not reactive. I had already spoken to him 2 months before the wedding. We had already discussed what was possible, what was advisable, and what needed to be in place. That Monday call was just confirmation. Everything was ready. On Monday evening, Ivy and Trent were still in Savannah for their honeymoon. On Tuesday morning, Ivy called me. Her voice was controlled, but I knew that voice. It was the voice she used when she was trying not to cry and not to panic at the same time. She said that Harriet had called her. She said Harriet wanted to come by the apartment on Wednesday. She said Harriet had mentioned something about estate planning for the family and that she'd be bringing someone to help with paperwork. I asked Ivy if Trent knew. She said yes. She said he'd told her it was just a formality. He said his mother liked to keep things organized. I listened to her explain all of this, and I thought about Harriet at that dinner asking about the inheritance. I thought about Trent's jaw on the night of the wedding. I thought about the phrase, just a formality, which was, in my experience, what people said when they wanted you to stop asking questions. I told Ivy to say yes to Wednesday. I told her to let Harriet come. I told her to make coffee, be polite, and under no circumstances sign a single piece of paper. Then I said, "I'll be there." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're already 3 steps ahead of this, aren't you?" I said, "Baby, I've been 3 steps ahead of this since October." Wednesday morning, I drove to Ivy's apartment in Westerville, and I was there by 9:30. Harriet was due at 11. Ivy looked exhausted. She and Trent had come back from Savannah a day early, and she'd barely slept. Trent was there too, quiet, not quite making eye contact with me. I sat in the living room and I drank the coffee Ivy made for me, and I said almost nothing. Harriet arrived at 11:02. She was dressed like she was going to a business lunch. Blazer, slacks, low heels. She had a man with her. She introduced him as a friend, a notary, someone who was just there to help with some paperwork. He had a briefcase. He had the practiced neutral expression of a man who had sat in a lot of living rooms watching a lot of things happen. Harriet sat down. She smiled at me. She said, "I didn't know you'd be here, Ruth." "My name is Ruth." I'd been waiting for 68 years to have exactly this conversation. I said I wouldn't miss it. There was a half-second where Harriet's smile didn't change, but her eyes did. Just slightly. Like something recalculating behind them. She turned to Ivy. She opened with warmth. How lovely the wedding was. How happy she was to have Ivy in the family. How much she'd been looking forward to this. Then she shifted into the business part. She explained that their family had certain financial arrangements that were customary when a new member joined. She used the word customary 3 times. She said it helped protect everyone. She said it was just a matter of aligning assets. She slid a document across the coffee table toward Ivy. I watched Ivy look at it. I watched Ivy's hands stay in her lap. Ivy said, "What exactly am I signing?" Harriet said it was just an acknowledgement, a disclosure, standard language that Trent had already reviewed. Ivy said, "I'd like to read it first." Harriet smiled. She said, "Of course." She said, "Take all the time you need." I reached over and picked up the document before Ivy touched it. It was 4 pages. I read it the way I'd read documents for 31 years, not word by word in order, but scanning for the clauses that mattered. It took me about 90 seconds. By the time I set it back down on the table, I had seen everything I needed to see. It was not a disclosure. It was not a standard acknowledgement. It was an agreement that would have given Trent, and by extension, Trent's family trust, a claim on any inherited assets Ivy brought into the marriage, retroactively from the date of the wedding. It was dressed in careful language. It would have looked like nothing to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. But I knew what I was looking at. I put the document down. I folded my hands on my knee. I looked at Harriet. I said, "I'd like to make a phone call before we go any further." Harriet said she didn't understand the need for a delay. I said that was fine. I understood it for both of us. I stepped into Ivy's kitchen and I called my attorney. He had been on standby since Monday. That was the second thing I hadn't told Ivy, that I had asked him to make himself available this week just in case. He answered on the first ring. I described the document in 60 seconds. He gave me 2 sentences I needed. I came back into the living room and I sat down. I told Harriet that the document she presented was attempting to override the terms of an irrevocable trust established prior to the marriage, which, in the state of Ohio, was not enforceable without the trustee's written consent, which would not be given. I also told her that presenting this type of document to a newlywed without prior legal disclosure or independent counsel for the signing party was something any family law attorney would find worth discussing. The notary closed his briefcase. I said that last part clearly, and I looked at the notary when I said it. The room was very quiet. Harriet looked at Trent. Trent looked at his hands. That was the moment I knew everything I needed to know about Trent, not from what he said, from what he didn't do. He didn't say, "Mom, what is this?" He didn't say. I didn't know it said that. He didn't look at Ivy with anything that resembled surprise. He just sat there with his hands on his knees and he looked at the floor and he said nothing at all. Ivy was watching him. I watched her watch him. Harriet gathered the document and put it back in her bag. She said there must have been some miscommunication. She said the family would need to revisit the language. She said this wasn't what she intended. I said, I know exactly what you intended. She stood up. The notary stood up. She said goodbye to Ivy with a warmth that had gone completely hollow. She looked at me once at the door, just once, and whatever she was thinking, she kept behind her eyes. After the door closed, the three of us sat in the apartment for a long moment without speaking. Then Trent said, I didn't know what was in the document. Ivy said, Trent? He said, I didn't. She told me it was standard. Ivy said, stop. There are things I will not repeat about that conversation because they belong to my granddaughter and not to me. What I will say is that I stood up and I told Ivy I loved her, and I told her that whatever she decided, I had made sure she had the ground under her feet to decide it freely. That was all I ever wanted, not to control what she chose, to make sure the choice was actually hers. I drove home to Columbus and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. There are women who will tell you that protecting yourself means you don't trust love. I disagree. I think protecting yourself is the precondition of trust. You cannot freely trust someone when you're standing on unsecured ground. I secured the ground. Everything that came after that was real. The love, the pain, the decision, all of it. Ivy and Trent separated 4 months later. She filed in August. The trust was never touched. The house she'd been living in with him was in her name only, which I had also insisted on before the wedding. One more thing she'd thought I was being overly cautious about. She moved back to Columbus in the fall. We had dinner every Sunday for a while. She'd sit across from me at the same table where I told her to trust her eyes, and sometimes she'd talk, and sometimes she'd just sit with her coffee in the quiet, and both of those were fine with me. One night she said, "Did you know it was going to end like this?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I said I didn't know how it would end. I just knew that whatever ended, I wanted her to still be standing when it did. She nodded. She looked out the window. She said, "You had that attorney ready before the wedding." I said, "Yes." She said, "Before the engagement?" I said, "Baby, I had that conversation before you brought him home the second time." She laughed. A real laugh, the kind she didn't make very often that year. And I laughed too, and the kitchen smelled like coffee, and outside it was getting dark over the east side of Columbus the way it always did in November, early and quiet and completely sure of itself. I have been 3 steps ahead my whole life because I had to be, because nobody was 3 steps ahead for me when I needed it, because I watched my daughter go out into the world without enough armor, and I lost her on a Tuesday morning in February. I would not lose Ivy. I have not lost Ivy. She's 31 now. She started a business. She has a good life. Not a perfect one, but a real one. And in my experience, a real one is worth 100 perfect ones. She calls me every few days. She still comes to Sunday dinner when she can. Last spring, she told me she'd started seeing someone new. She said he was kind. She said he was patient. She said she'd told him that her grandmother was the most important person in her life, and that if he had a problem with that, it would be a short relationship. I told her that sounded right to me. Then I asked her what his last name was. She laughed again, but she told me. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that apartment on a Wednesday morning in Westerville. Not the legal part. I understood that clearly enough before I walked in the door. I mean what happened underneath it. Because when Harriet slid that document across the coffee table, she wasn't just trying to take money. She was betting that I hadn't prepared. She was betting that love made people careless, and that a grandmother's concern was just noise, an old woman made. She was wrong on every count. That's the thing about consequences. They don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, shaped entirely by the choices made before the moment of reckoning arrives. Harriet spent years watching families and calculating what she could take from them. She built a strategy around other people's carelessness, and for a long time, I imagine it worked. But she walked into a room where the other person had spent 31 years reading exactly the kind of paperwork she was carrying. Every action has a cost that gets paid eventually. She paid hers on a Wednesday morning when a notary closed his briefcase and walked out of my granddaughter's apartment without a single signature. What I want people to understand, what I think matters most in all of this, is that wisdom isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you build deliberately over time out of everything you've paid attention to. I didn't protect Ivy because I was naturally suspicious or because I was lucky. I protected her because I spent decades learning how documents work, how people use language to obscure what they're actually doing, and how greed tends to move, slowly at first, then all at once, right after a wedding. I built that knowledge on purpose. Knowledge is not passive. It is a choice you make every day to pay attention, to learn, to take what life teaches you and actually use it. And Ivy, she carried her part of this too. When I sat her down at my kitchen table in November and told her what I was afraid of, she listened. Not because I demanded it, because she had spent 29 years watching me be someone worth listening to. That trust between us was not automatic. It was earned through every hard conversation, every time I told her something she didn't want to hear and turned out to be right, every time I showed up when showing up was inconvenient. Integrity compounds the same way. Debt does. You either build it over years or you spend years paying for not having it. Trent sat in that apartment and said nothing when it mattered. I don't think he was a monster. I think he was a man who had never built the habit of standing for something when it cost him something. That silence, that choosing of comfort over honesty, had a price too, and he paid it over the following 4 months. Ivy is 31 now. She's doing well. And I think the most honest thing I can tell you is this. I didn't save her. I gave her the ground to stand on. She did the standing herself. That's all any of us can really do for the people we love. Not remove every danger, but make sure they have what they need to face it. The rest is up to them.